So 2 years ago when winter arrived, I got a small shipment of graffiti supplies, markers, and mops that I thought would be good specifically for winter. And a few of you guys said that that was actually really helpful. And because of that, today we are going to be ranking every single graffiti mop and marker that we have reviewed here on the channel. So dozens and dozens and dozens for winter specifically. And pay attention here, because the reason I'm doing it this way is so that no matter what graffiti supplies you have that you like to tag with, at some point in the video I will be talking about that particular graffiti supply most likely. So if you need to take a minute, take a look at your stash of graph supplies, see which ones you have, what ones you might want to know about, if they're good or not so great for winter tagging. And while we get started, I'll give you an idea of what kind of factors tend to make mops or markers better or worse for that winter tagging purpose. So let's get to it. Now the first graffiti supply we are talking about is mops. Absolute D tier. I know the video just started, I know you're all mad at me already, but hear me out. Not all mops, just these mops. One thing about all of these mops they all have in common, they're all filled with a paint formula. And paint formula, no matter what the base of the paint is, they tend to have a higher freezing point than, say, your ink formulae. And you can't tag that well with paint that is going to freeze before it dries. Freezing actually entirely disrupts the drying process, and it makes it so that whatever you're tagging on, it's not really permanent in any respect. So you cannot have freezing before drying. Hopefully that makes sense. And not to mention, in seriously cold temperatures, if you're living up north, sometimes your mop nib will freeze in contact with whatever surface you're trying to write on outdoors, especially if it's metal, right? So paint mops in particular, honestly, D tier. And that includes anything like the Chisel Tip 004, the Krink K60 a lot of you guys might have, the 003, I love this mop, but it's paint filled, right? If you have any Superflow mops from OTR that are filled with paint, the Montana Street Dabbers with their paint formula, OTR 007, any of the Grog FMP sizes here, you know, Iron Lac Uzis, if you picked one of those up once upon a time, Molotov Dripsticks Mini, your dang paint mops, any of those, anything filled with a paint formula, they just don't hold up in cold the same way that ink formulae do. Part of that is the base, but part of it is just how paint works. So I know I just took a lot of items off of your list that you probably want to be using for the outdoor tagging environment during winter. So luckily we've got all the other ones that we're going to talk about as well. So hopefully there's something in your graffiti stash that will work a little better for winter. That being said, I do have links in the description to as many of the graffiti mops and markers as I can that we're going to be talking about today. So if at any point you decide you want to pick any of them up, you can find them in the description if I was able to find something reasonable to buy. And just if you are wondering specifically about your graffiti mops, where they rank compared to each other, we did a full video you can check out in the corner ranking every single graffiti mop I have ever used if you want to see where your mops fall specifically. That being said, at the beginning I mentioned Turbo Vinyl. Turbo Vinyl sent over a few of their vinyl slabs for me as a sample, and these are gorgeous. Turbo Vinyl is a small printing company that focuses on making high quality stickers and prints for artists, including graffiti artists. The owner of the company messaged me himself, super nice guy named Matt. The nice finish on vinyl stickers is just what you want for that water resistance. So if you just so happen to be in the market for getting some stickers printed, you can follow the first link in the description to the Turbo Vinyl site, and if you use my link in the description, it'll get you 10% off your whole order and it'll apply automatically. Or you can always use the code SCIZ at checkout on the Turbo Vinyl site, and that'll get you the 10% off as well. So if you need any stickers printed, you would be supporting a small business, that being Turbo Vinyl, and you are supporting the channel here, another small business. So cheers for that in advance. So the next group of graffiti supplies is these mops. And as you may have guessed, all of these mops are filled with ink formulae instead of paint. Now, the thing with ink formulae specifically is inks in general have lower freezing points than most paint formulae do, especially water-based paints. So because of that lower freezing point, a lot of these ink mops can be used to write on surfaces that have a far lower temperature. Last year I did a video on the top 5 graffiti markers for winter tagging specifically. If you want more detail on what ink formulae, what ink bases tend to do better in colder temperatures, you can check that video in the corner or in the description to get the details on that. But here, of course, we're talking about the dang ink formula, the Molotov dripstick filled with an ink. We've got a OTR 006 with their OTR ink in it, all of which are alcohol-based inks I can add. I have the block by block in there as well. This is a Superflow marker by OTR, but it's filled with the Grog Buff Proof ink, also alcohol based. Got the Street Killer ink in the Street Dabber there, and this Genoba one I have it filled with an ink, so I figured I'd include it. But in general, mops with ink like these, gotta say B tier for them solidly. And while we're at it, we have to talk about chisel tip paint markers, and in fact bullet tip paint markers. So with this one, you know, the OTR Bullet 4001 T-shape chisel tips like that. As one example, Molotov 440p, this is the copper burner. It's got a T-shape on there as well. It's a 20mm chisel tip. Any of your standard ones will have a 15mm flat chisel on there as well, like the Grog Cutter or the 8 Grog Cutter Mini. I won't spend too much time on these. It's very much the same reasoning as with your paint-filled graffiti mops. Believe it or not, adding a complex valve flow system to paint that's already having trouble not freezing does not make it any better. In fact, it is that valve system that I would say makes these even worse for winter tags than mops. That valve system, just colder temperatures, colder liquids, harder to flow through these, harder for the nibs to get the paint through there. If you needed a reason to not try the 50mm Molotov Masterpiece, this is kind of it. With the ink-filled chisel and bullet tips, such as the OTR .160, which just happens to be filled with an ink here, or the Molotov 612 tank marker, you guys know where I'm going with this. The ink that happens to be in these chisel tips makes these a little more viable for winter tagging conditions, gives them that extra bit of utility over the paint-filled alternatives. One bad thing about these markers specifically though is some of their capping systems are super snug, which can be a problem if you're using gloves, which if you're experiencing a real winter you probably are. So some of the caps can be hard to remove, although I have seen that be the opposite where it's harder with screw-on systems as well. It kind of just depends on the gloves you're wearing, honestly. So in general, these guys, B tier. I do want to emphasize though something special about the Molotov tank markers here. As soon as you have a tank marker and you're not pumping it, the flow regulation happens automatically with this tank marker. So the advantage of that is flow is just harder in colder conditions. So if you eliminate the pumping, you're kind of just eliminating one of the factors that can cause you problems in your valves during cold temperatures. So these tank markers, you know, this one in particular might be an A tier. So next we're going to be talking about some more specific smaller groups of graffiti supplies, or even some singular graffiti tools individually because they need their own rating. The first of those being shoe polish mops. Now there's no getting around the fact that the sponge nibs on these things are super fragile, even in the best of times, right? Even if you have these filled with an ink, it's hard to keep these nibs together. And although I love the look of the tags you can do with this style of mop, they're just not super practical for winter. You don't want to be adding to that fragility that already exists, a risk of freezing and tearing up a nib that way as well, especially because these nibs tend to be a little bit harder to find replacements for than normal mop nibs. Another thing you may not have considered about shoe polish mops specifically is that they are notoriously messy. And if any of you guys have ever had paint freeze to your hands, you know it's not fun. So shoe polish mops specifically in winter conditions, I would say C tier. Next up, we have whiteout pens and small metal heads. Personally, for me, metal heads like this are just kind of, I don't like using them at the best of times. But part of that for winter specifically is that usually inks are too thin to go through something like this and have any semblance of flow regulation, so they're just too drippy. Some of you drip heads out there might argue with me on that, but that's just my opinion. So my point is, usually if you get anything pre-filled like these 8000 ones, it comes with a paint, and I've talked enough about what paint does. That being said, some random whiteout pens come with some pretty serious fluid in them. One I want to highlight is the OTR Speed White Correction Pen fluid. It might actually already be discontinued because it has some very harsh drying up problems because of its xylene base. Now, xylene bases, as I've said, tend to do really well in colder temperatures. So if you had a whiteout pen like this that was filled with a xylene base, I'd have to say B tier. But in general, whiteout pens for winter, it's got to be a D tier product. Next up, we're talking about your angled chisel tip markers, just the standard ones that you can get, such as the Pilot Super Colors, the Pen Touch by Sakura, even your Magic Ink glass bodies. As I'm sure you guys are learning, a lot of this comes down to what's in your marker, what's in your mop. Any standard marker like this, and this extends to even markers like Copic markers or any other sketch marker, they all just have those tank systems for flow, and they are filled with an ink. So in summary, that makes them do pretty all right on cold temperature surfaces. So solid B tier for these guys. Posca Mop bars. Yes, they get their own category on this list, and I hate to tell you, but it's not for a good reason. Now, one of the main pitfalls of these in any condition is the sponge nib that they come with. It's brutal. It doesn't stay intact in the best of times. That combined with their super transparent water-based paint formula just means that in cold conditions, it's going to have an even harder time dealing with that water-based paint running through that sponge nib. That, coupled with the fact that this design of mop in particular is one of the messiest mop designs I have personally used, does not bode well. You will end up with some paint on your hands and you're not going to be happy about it during winter. So, Posca Mop are B tier. The next group of markers we are talking about here are the angled and flat chisel tip markers from AeroMark and Mighty Marker. Now, these are your standard kind of 6 to 8 millimeter angled chisel tip there. Very, very clean marker to write with. But the reason we're talking about them in particular here is because their paint and ink formulae are something tough, let me tell you. They're both xylene based, although the paint do tend to have some flow issues I've found and are hard to mix effectively. The xylene base holds up really well in both, and I want to make sure I highlight the IM14 bleed through. With these ink formulae in them, this is a solid A tier marker for your winter graffiti tagging. In case any of you are wondering, well, what about the very similar looking Krink K71 here? It ain't the same. The ink in these Krink markers, although it is an ink and will do a bit better in winter, it just doesn't stand up like these other ones do. And these ones are cheaper anyway, so I would recommend them solidly over a Krink K71. Now this here is the block by block ½ ounce mop. More of you are probably familiar with the Art Primo version of this mop, which is called the Toxic Shocker. Same concept. Basically, it is a hard body, non-squeezable marker. Now the advantage of that in this instance is that it's just a little bit less messy. It's not as many drips happening. In this instance, it does have its pros. So if you can fill it with a good ink or something like that, for winter, B tier product for sure. Next up, kind of a funny one to give its own category to, but we're talking about the OTR roller ball. Now, if you haven't seen one of these before, I'll show you. It's got a very wide roller ball on there. Hopefully you can see that. This one has a mop body on it, and it's filled with an alcohol-based ink. So of course the ink's better than the paint, but the thing with these roller balls specifically is they're very, very messy, I've found, especially recapping. I'm finding I'm having to give the threads of this thing an acetone bath fairly frequently. So although it's not paint, you still don't want to be getting it on your hands during winter and whatnot. Because of that, C tier for winter for this guy. Now, metal tip paint markers like the Krink K66 here or the Grog Metalhead, they are paint filled at the end of the day, right? So not a great start, but you knew I was going to say that. I find the Grog Metalhead in particular a little bit messier anyways, so for winter specifically, these guys, although they're a cool tool, gotta say D tier. The other metal heads that have this kind of pump system on the back, I'll be honest, I don't actually have any real idea what is inside these Dykem Daylo markers. All I know is it's a very serious formula and has a lot of staying power, and it tends to just work all the time. As far as this goes for winter use, I would say B tier, just because I do have to acknowledge it is a very slow marker. You are sitting there for days trying to do tags sometimes, and I'm almost not exaggerating. The Krink K90, on the other hand, is solidly D tier in this regard, and any other. If you want more information on that, you can click the video in the corner or the description where we talked about the top 5 worst graffiti supplies of all time, and I go in a bit more depth about why that is. Now, these next few are ones that generally have a few advantages to them when it comes to winter graffiti tagging. So if you're actually looking to pick up any specific graffiti supplies for the next few months, then this is exactly where you're gonna wanna be. That first group, solid paint sticks. Now, I'm gonna be honest, there's a huge range here, especially for winter. You guys know how much I just adore the Markal B paint sticks. In general, they're a great freight writing tool. I always have a link in the description to where you can pick up a bulk pack of them for much cheaper than a lot of the graffiti sites have them for. But I'll be honest here, I'm putting my bias to the side. These aren't your best option for winter. They don't do bad by any means. Basically, any solid paint stick, you kind of don't have to worry about freezing because, you know, the paint's already solid, right? So although in winter these aren't as nice as writing on smooth, buttery, hot freight metal or something like that, they're solid enough, no pun intended. I'm gonna give it B tier just because you're not dealing with any liquid, like I said, which can be a big advantage. Other popular paint sticks, Sakuras and hand mix. I don't have any full-size Sakuras with me actually, but I'm sure you guys are familiar with the product. A lot of you out there use it, I know that. I always get some converse opinions about Sakura streakers in my comment sections when I say pretty much anything about them. So what I would recommend is after you listen to my experiences with the Sakura streakers and the hand mix, you check the comments because no doubt there are some real Sakura enthusiasts down there that can share their experiences with them as well, so that way you have more of a balanced view. But I do have to stick with, again, my experiences consistently using these, and that is just in general, hand mix and Sakura streakers are just too sticky for me. I have had a lot of people say that that's only a problem with the white Sakuras or just the black ones. I don't know, I've just found them pretty consistently too sticky, and that gets a lot worse with colder temperatures. So in general, the hand mix and Sakura streakers, I am totally comfortable just putting them B tier. I honestly do think it's kind of the same thing it always comes down to with paint sticks. It's personal preference. That being said, the Sakura solid streakers that are specifically for cold temperatures, I have found them nicer to write with in cold temperatures and actually in regular temperatures as well. It's just a bit of a harder formula, which I prefer that extra bit of resistance when I'm doing tags. So they feel really good for me, and I haven't experienced any stickiness with these cold temperature Sakuras. So you're pushing like high B tier for these guys specifically. A last one here, just because some of you guys might have this, the Krink K90. I don't really have much positive stuff to say about it. If you have one, good luck. It's not the option I would choose. One other one I want to mention for sure is the Genko Solid Streaker by Magic Ink. Now these are a little expensive, I just want to warn you guys, but I for sure have to say they are so smooth and buttery with the paint formula, and it is a solid stick. And for these ones in particular, no matter what the temperature, I've not really had any stickiness associated with them whatsoever. They're just so buttery and soft. Dare I say it, this is almost as close as you can get to a perfect graffiti marker for winter. No mess, solid, no freezing. I'm putting this S tier, believe it or not. And I'm pretty sure I can find a good link to a pack of these for you in the description. 2 other solid sticks I don't want anyone to forget about because they're serious contenders for your winter graffiti writing needs. Got the Molotov Scrawl Stick and the Flame Wax Marker. Now, both of these are ink-infused wax rather than solid paint. So the difference with that is wax is very, very slippery and soft to write with. And although the ink isn't as important in this regard because it's not really drying, you do get that same staining effect with it, and it is very soft to write with during winter, which almost all of the other paint sticks, there's just not that softness there. Although I would never put these wax graffiti markers in S tier for probably any other kind of ranking list, for winter graffiti specifically, these guys are S tier, I think. And next up here we have the Pentel Shorty White, or the Pentel 100W. Now, this marker it's just good, I'll be honest. The oil-based formula in it just tends to do really well in cold, I find. I don't even know if it's really technically a paint or an ink, but I do know it's oil-based, and it just tends to work really well. The marker itself, super fun, super well constructed. If you want to see a video of how we modded this to make it a chisel tip marker just like this and refilled it, even though they're not really supposed to be refillable, you can check the video out in the corner there to see how we did all of that. But for winter, A tier mop for sure. And the next winter killer is definitely the Uni PX30s silver and gold, or the PX20s if you have them as well, the slightly smaller nib size. These are your angled chisel tips, very standard size, and it has that all important and impressive oil-based paint formula. These are solid A tier markers for your winter graffiti tagging. The only thing I don't like about them is the caps are hard enough to get off without gloves, let alone with gloves. I don't know why they made them the way they did, so that's a slight hindrance. So I know I grouped a lot of mops together at the beginning of the video, and like I said, if you want to know exactly where your mops rank compared to each other, I ranked every single graffiti mop that I have ever used from D tier to God tier. You can check that video on screen right now. I hope to see you over there soon. Thanks as always to the patrons and channel members, and don't forget you can use the link in the description for Turbo Vinyl to get yourself some discounts on high quality vinyl slabs. But I'll see you in that video soon. Peace.